I thank the chairman for holding today's hearing, and I also extend my condolences to the families of the 4 people killed during last week's shooting at Fort Hood, and additional prayers are with the 16 people who were injured during that shooting. And I do want to recognize the first responder community and medical personnel for their incredible response to the shooting. As of today, the Joint Terrorism Task Force does not consider the shooting an act of terrorism. However, the investigation is still ongoing. I am going to read into the record the comments from our ranking member, Mr. Thompson of Mississippi, which I concur with. Incident like last week's shooting and last year's Boston Marathon bombing, the focus of today's hearing, remind us of the importance of our first responders. With that being said, I again commend the service of our witnesses, former Commissioner Davis, Chief Devereux, Sergeant Pugliese, and I also thank Professor Leonard for recognizing their courageous efforts in his research. Resilience and response are 2 of the reasons why almost a year ago, the Boston metropolitan area, remained strong. I wish Mayor Walsh, President of the Boston Athletic Association, Joanne Flamino, and all the runners and volunteers participating in the 118th Boston Marathon well as the race commences on the 21st of April of this year. Even though Boston is standing strong, it would be a disservice to the community not to take a look back. There are still unanswered questions about the history of the Zarnovar brothers, the alleged Boston Marathon bombers, and we owe it to the people of Boston and the rest of America to make sure that the appropriate officials do a thorough review of that situation. Last April, the Inspectors General of the intelligence community, Departments of Homeland Security, and Justice and the Central Intelligence Agency announced a joint investigation into whether intelligence was properly distributed and acted upon in the months and the years before the bombings at the Boston Marathon. I find it rather unfortunate, however, that the review was delayed because of the senseless 16-day government shutdown in October of 2013. Partisan disagreements create serious gaps in Homeland Security oversight, and this is just one example of the myriad of setbacks that the shutdown yielded. Another development since last year is Attorney General Holder's January 13th announcement that the U.S. would be seeking the death penalty against Tamerlan Zarnov, the alleged Boston Marathon bomber. He was arrested and indicted, and I have declared my confidence in his receiving a fair yet aggressive prosecution in the United States District Court for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Mr. Chairman, as a former federal prosecutor, you know Attorney General Holder's decision to seek the death penalty is a game changer. I'm sure you are familiar with the intricacies involved in a capital case. As I reminded the committee last year, as we fulfill our constitutional oversight responsibilities, we must be careful not to jeopardize a federal prosecution. This applies in both the words that we speak to the public as well as the publications that stem from this committee. Unfortunately, some of the actions that have extended from this committee have not been helpful to the Department of Justice. On March 26th, a majority staff report endorsed by a minority of the members of this committee was released to the public. Less than 48 hours after the report's release, Zarnov's defense team filed a motion in the United States District Court citing this report. I reemphasize that as members of Congress, especially as members of the Homeland Security Committee, we are held to a heightened standard. We are trusted with both classified and unclassified briefings and meetings with the members of the intelligence community. And therefore, the words that we speak or we publish about alleged terrorists transcend the halls of this Congress and are not taken lightly by the public. And furthermore, this not only applies to events surrounding Boston, but also to other events with pending investigations. Reaching conclusions before facts are known puts the reputation of this committee at peril. and thus we must exercise discretion in our questioning and our statements about events, suspects, and the links to others that may not be in custody. But in spite of those limitations, Mr. Chairman, we can still use our platform to have a productive discussion about the Boston Marathon bombing and act on outstanding matters. For example, we can and we should discuss the funding given to the first responder community. Last year, at the Committee on Homeland Security's first hearing on the Boston Marathon bombings, former Commissioner Davis stated that without grant funding, and I quote, "the response would have been much less comprehensive than it was. And without the exercises supported through the Urban Area Security Initiative funding, there would be more people who died in these attacks." And Professor Leonard's testimony also indicates that this type of preparedness is what makes first response effective. Sergeant Pugliese is also testifying today that local municipal governments are not financially equipped to take on the increasing burden of these catastrophic attacks like Boston. It is time that we not only listen to the first responders, but that we also take action. Not only after last year's hearing, but also hearings throughout several Congresses, members have heard about the importance of these grant programs and the success stories involving them. And accordingly, I urge members to oppose the administration's proposal to shift focus away from supporting state and local efforts to develop terrorism-related prevention and preparedness capabilities by morphing the Homeland Security grant program into an all-hazards grant. I'm not convinced that the administration's underfunded grant consolidation proposal would provide sufficient support for first responders across America to build and maintain the capabilities necessary to respond as effectively as the first responders in Boston and Watertown did after the bombings last year. We learned from 9/11 that it is the local responders that are there on the scene. And I cannot support any grant reform proposal until I'm convinced that it would provide the support necessary to maintain the terrorism preparedness capabilities that we have spent building now for over a decade. Also, I agree with the chairman that we cannot ignore that information sharing between federal, state, and local authorities needs strengthening. Since September 11th, information sharing silos that the 9/11 commissioners recommended be addressed continue to be exposed after tragic events. We need to work together to develop ways to fix that problem as soon as possible. And we must also consider the economic cost of terrorism. In response to the events of September 11th, Congress enacted the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act of 2002. That measure increased the availability of terrorism risk insurance to at-risk American businesses by guaranteeing that the government would share some of the losses with private insurance should a terrorist attack occur at a building. That act is set to sunset this year. According to the RAND Corporation, allowing this act to expire would harm our national security. And last year, Mr. Thompson introduced a bill that would extend the act and add some needed improvements, and I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor that legislation. And even though it has been almost a year since the bombings, there have been some game-changing moments, and some ships are still anchored. As we continue to seek answers, I remind us to be responsible and to act within our constitutional boundaries. The people of Boston are looking for our leadership on this issue. And I yield back the balance of my time and ask that the full statement be put into the record.